Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again. There may be some newbies and there may be some people who've been watching our series, but today I'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sable International Investment Migration Series, and we'll be talking about Australia, that wonderful country down under. And before I kick off, just by way of introduction, my name is Andy Rissick. I'm the Group Commercial Director, and I look after the investment migration business. I'm based down in Cape Town, obviously South African, you can hear. I've spent many years living in the UK and Europe, and came back to South Africa about 18 years ago. And just a little bit about that gentleman sitting next to me on the screen. That is Sam Hopwood. He will introduce himself to you a little bit later on, but he's sitting down in our office in Melbourne, and he will be telling you about all the different investment visas as a way to acquire access to Australia. So also just to let you know, there will be a Q&A at the end, and I would imagine that the entire webinar will probably last no more than 45 minutes. And if we don't manage to get to answer your particular question, one of us will get in touch with you afterwards to make sure that we do answer that. But please feel free on the right-hand side of the screen to put any questions in, whether for myself or for Sam. But on this particular subject, Sam is the specialist. For those of you who don't know Sable International, just a little bit about our company and our group. We've been in business for 26 years now. The company started in 1994 in the United Kingdom. Our partner, Reg Bamford, started the company to service predominantly an expat Australian and New Zealand communities in London. And that was really the birth of Sable International as it's known today. And the business really helped people with international requirements in the UK, coming in from a lot of the ex sort of Commonwealth countries. But over time, our business has really changed a lot, and as our clients have sort of grown up and scattered all over the world. And what we've realized is that with a predominantly South African focus, is that South Africans have got very complex international needs. And our business has evolved to be able to really help people with a broad approach to make sure that you do a successful internationalization of either yourself, could be your wealth, or even maybe your family or your children, etc., etc. So we can help clients move money through our Forex business. We're very competitive on rates, and we are licensed in all the jurisdictions that we operate. We've got offices in London and Europe and Australia and South Africa. We specialize in cross-border tax advice in all the jurisdictions that we work. And we also have an offshore wealth management capability. So we can help one using their annual allowances to invest offshore. We can actually assist you not only with moving your funds offshore, but actually managing it, whether it's through an equity portfolio. We do help clients with all sorts of interesting offshore investments. We have an accounting capability in London, and we help a lot of companies set up their subsidiaries in the UK. And that's a very popular business and important part of our group. And then we've got our residency and citizenship business, and what we're talking about today really sort of falls in that bubble. But there are lots of ways that one can move abroad. You can do it through acquiring a skills visa and going to countries that are looking for certain skills. It could be through a spousal visa if you're married to somebody who's entitled to go and live in a foreign country. There are lots of different ways, but what we also find is there are lots of people who don't particularly want to up sticks and leave, and through investment they may want to acquire a plan B or a second residency for themselves and their families. And today we feel that Australia, we offer a very broad range, and Sam will talk a little bit about that. But today we'll be focusing on the routes to get into Australia through investment. So that's just a little bit of a summary of who we are. And as I said, today we're talking about Australia. There's the Sydney Opera House, a very iconic building in a very beautiful city. So without further ado, Sam, welcome, and thanks for staying up late. I know it's probably dark there already and probably almost bedtime, but thanks very much for joining us at a time that suits our clients probably a bit better than you. And I'll just ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then you're in charge for the rest of the way until the Q&A.
Thank you, Andy. It is a little bit past my bedtime. It's just gone 10 o'clock, so I'm normally wrapped up in bed at this time of night reading a good book. But I'm very happy to be here tonight to present this webinar and to try and educate our clients and prospective clients on all things Australian. Personally, I have been with the business for, I lose count, I think this is my 16th or 17th year. I started in the UK back in 2015 in London. I was travelling the UK as most Australians do in their younger years. I'm lucky enough to have a British and Australian passport, and was caught up in the UK for 5 or 6 years. This particular employer that I'm still with now was the first employer I had in London, and I just happened to strike upon a very good relationship with who turned out to be a very good employer, and quickly found myself in a role in a UK immigration advisory role. Learnt the ropes and sort of kicked on from there. And now I'm a registered migration agent here in Australia. I've been a registered agent for 8 years now. I've been back home here in Australia for just over 10 years now. I run the Melbourne office. Personally, I'm not from Melbourne. I'm from north of the border, so I'm a New South Welshman, born and bred in Sydney. My family and friends still hail from Sydney, so I'm a Mexican according to the rest of them, because I'm south of the border now. So I'm somewhat shunned as a Mexican these days. But yes, very happy to live here in Melbourne. I'm a sports fan, and fortunately, Melbourne is everything sports when it comes to Australia. We've got the Formula One, we've got the tennis, we've got the MCG, we've got the Boxing Day Test. AFL is huge here in Australia, so for those of you who have been to Melbourne before, you'll probably appreciate what I'm talking about, because everyone here is sports mad. And for those of you who've yet to come to Melbourne, I encourage you to come down and take a look at this city. It's said to be the most European city of all the cities here in Australia. We have a very fine coffee culture. We are coffee snobs, in fact. Don't be asking for a large latte. People look down their nose at you. Personally, I drink a long macchiato, which is quite common here in Melbourne, but in other parts of the country, they look at me a little bit funny. Yeah, so that's me. I live and breathe immigration and have done for a long time. I'm welcoming of all types of questions. I've been around long enough to hear most of them. So if you think you've got one which might trip me up, please put it to me. I'll be happy to hear it.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And then look, I think you're better placed to speak to the audience about why choose Australia. But just before you do, I think it's important to mention that we like it very much as a group, as part of our migration solutions. And I think predominantly it is such a similar lifestyle to what South Africans are used to, but more importantly, it is English speaking, and it just makes it easier. But Sam, over to you. I'll let you steer the way forward, and I know you've got some good humor, so we'll see you at Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, look, why choose Australia? Before I tell you why you should choose Australia, I'll just let you know that I've travelled to South Africa every couple of years, sometimes 3 times a year for the past 15 years. So I know a lot about South Africa. I know a lot about South Africans. I've travelled all over South Africa. I have a lot of good friends who are South African. So I understand your culture, I understand your humour, I understand what you're all about, and I think I understand why Australia makes a lot of sense as to why you would enjoy migrating to Australia as opposed to other countries around the world. So I'm going to give you some stats and statistics here. So according to the United Nations, Australia is the 2nd best country in the world to live in. According to me, it's the best country to live in, but that's up for debate. The UN measure 187 different countries over a bunch of different metrics, and those are typical metrics that you would expect to see in any report or magazine that was talking about migration, and they are quite easy to identify their education, their health, their lifestyle, security, wealth, etc. So, I mean, we rank very highly across the world when it comes to these metrics. We've got a great education system. We've got a great healthcare system. Our lifestyle, you can see by the picture there on the left-hand side is the Gold Coast, and we have this outdoors lifestyle that we embrace. Security, we're one of the safest countries in the world. I have travelled South Africa with some friends and family in the past, and have had to educate them on, how South Africa at times isn't so safe, and how you have to protect yourself here and there. And obviously we're a first world country, and we're quite a wealthy country. We have a lot of resources, and we've done quite well on the global scale whilst selling those resources. So those are the easy things. Those are the statistics that you hear and read in tables and in books. But mostly, though, you choose Australia because it's got all the good stuff that South Africa's got. And I know South Africa's got all this good stuff. You've got great education. You've got great lifestyle. You've got fantastic wineries, and you've got beaches, and you've got things that I love going and seeing whilst I'm in South Africa as well. So we've got all the good stuff that you've got, but we haven't got as much as the bad stuff. So we don't have the crime. We don't have those stories that you have about home invasions and, having your car stolen. And yes, we do have crime, but we just don't have it on the same scale that you do. And most importantly, I think, is we speak the same language as South Africans, and that's not Zulu. We don't speak Zulu. And when I talk about language, I don't talk about the English language, although we do share that, and that is important, and it does make life easy. But by language, I mean the language of culture, and that is, you braai and we barbecue. We play rugby, not as good as you. We play cricket, although we probably shouldn't talk about it. Let's not talk about what happened in Cape Town. But we enjoy the outdoors and our culture and our business practices, our tax systems and our schooling and our general way of life. They're similar to you, to South Africa. And this makes things, it makes it really important when you're transitioning, when you're choosing a country to migrate to. Why not choose a country which is similar to you in a lot of respects? So when you get here, you don't have to relearn a new language, and your assimilation is easier. Because I do talk to people who come to Australia or who have migrated to other countries and do struggle to actually find their feet in a new country. It's not entirely easy, but I think coming to Australia, where we have a similar culture, will make it easier. All right, I think I've sold Australia enough there, and we can move on to some other topics. So we're a big country. I live down here in Melbourne. As I said, my family live in Sydney. That's roughly 1,000 kilometres away. And Perth's on the other side of the country. It's a good 5-hour flight away. But what COVID's taught us, if nothing else, is that the world is actually a small place, and the country's a small place, and technology works to your benefit. And I would ask each and every one of you, if you think you're migrating to Australia to a certain place because you have friends there or you have family there, just consider for a moment that you might not be able to migrate to that particular city because of visa regulations, for example, but that you might be able to migrate to a different city. And that's a good thing, that you can still get into Australia, and maybe not your first choice as far as state or city is concerned, but that traveling within Australia is very easy. We have cheap internal flights. I can fly from Melbourne to the Gold Coast for sometimes it's on special for $120, which in our world is not a lot of money. So we're a big country, but technology and internal domestic flights, etc., has made us small enough that it doesn't really matter where you are. I'm in Melbourne, but I do business with people in Sydney and in Brisbane and in Perth. You're not limited by your location and your offering just because you happen to be physically located in a particular place in Australia. We have a lot of clients who migrate from, say, somewhere in South Africa, from Johannesburg, and they've got a business in Joburg, and they want to go to Perth specifically because Perth's only 6 hours ahead of Joburg. So, whilst it's sort of 3 o'clock in their afternoon, it's 8 o'clock in your morning type of thing, and the crossover is easy. You can manage 2 businesses in 2 different countries. So there's benefits of being on the East Coast and on the West Coast. But again, I would just try and stress to you, don't think that you have to be in a particular location because of friends or family. You can travel around and see friends and family. Don't limit yourself by location is my recommendation. You don't always get what you want immediately, but you might get it at a later date. And once I explain the visa subclasses in some more detail, that'll make more sense. So let's talk about the visas. Look, today I'm only going to talk about 3 different visa types. They are broadly referred to as the Australian business and investment visas. They fall under subclass 188. Every Australian visa has a numerical value attached to it. We refer to it as a subclass. So in this case, we're talking about 188s, A's, B's, and C's. Now, I'm talking today about criteria and regulations which will be effective as of the 1st of July. So a bit of a disclaimer, if you go and were to read the law today and the regulations and some of the websites and information which is out there, it may not reflect what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about changes which were announced in December last year, which will become effective on 1st of July this year. So I don't think it's any point in me telling you about what's the law today, but it is changing in less than 2 months' time. In 2 months' time, or in less than 2 months' time, you won't have an opportunity to submit a visa application anyway, so we might as well talk about what's coming. So we used to have 9 different visas within this stream. We only have 4 now, and I'm going to specifically talk about 3 of those streams. So there's some common features to each of these visas, and I'm just going to read through these dot points. So all of these visas are temporary, and they're granted for a period of 5 years, or they will be after 1st of July. And they can be converted to permanent residence after 3 years. So you'll be eligible, you'll have a pathway to permanent residency after 3 years. These are all state-nominated visas, meaning that you must approach one of the state governments, you must gain their support. The state is said to nominate you in order for you to be eligible to apply for a visa. You must be invited to apply for a visa before you can go ahead and submit a visa application. You then make a commitment to live in that state until you are granted your permanent residency. So the state is making a commitment to give you a nomination, and you are making a commitment, and you are obliged then to live and work and do your business and settle in that particular state. The state governments have a limited quota of visas, and so the state governments are quite demanding in their requirements when assessing you, the potential migrant. And so it's important for everyone to understand that the states are in competition with each other. So there's 7 states and territories here in Australia, and the federal government hand out a certain number of visas to each of the states, and they say, well, here's your allocation and here's your allocation, and that's all you get. So some states get more than others, depending on their size and what their demand usually is. And some states are trying to attract more migrants to their state than others are. So each of the states have their own individual criteria as to what type of migrants they're trying to attract, what type of migrants with what particular types of businesses they're trying to attract. So just because you want to go to New South Wales, for example, doesn't mean that New South Wales might want you. So you might not be the type of migrant that New South Wales wants. Your type of business might not be what New South Wales is looking for. And because New South Wales has so many applicants, they have the opportunity to pick and choose through those applicants. And then potentially you might not get nominated by New South Wales. However, perhaps you might get nominated by South Australia. And so this is what I'm talking about, you know, we're a big country, but you need to think about different states as different opportunities. If you can get into South Australia and nominated by them, go and live in Adelaide, put your business there or invest there in Adelaide, and you can still do business across the rest of Australia. So those are the three types of visas that we're going to talk about today. They are the Business and Innovation Visa, subclass 188A, the Investor Visa, 188B, and the Significant Investor Visa, 188C. So Business and Innovation Visa, 188A. So this visa is predominantly for people who are interested in coming to Australia and actively managing a business. You need to be involved in managing that business. You can buy into a new business. You can bring your existing business. You can start a business from scratch. But you need to be coming to Australia with the intent of working actively within a business. The general criteria is that you must be under the age of 55. There is an exception to the rule. You can be over the age of 55 if you can demonstrate that your business and you as a person and your wealth will bring significant economic advantage to the state. So if your business is considerably large, or you have a new patent, or you have special exports that's going to bring Australia large income, then the state government have the ability to waive the criteria of the age if they see that you're going to bring significant economic advantage to the state. You need to demonstrate that you have had an overall successful career in business, and you need to demonstrate that in at least 2 out of the past 4 years, you've had an ownership stake in a business with an annual turnover of at least 750,000 Australian dollars. Now, like I said, this criteria has changed recently, so this is not the criteria that you'll find on the website at the moment. At the moment, the website talks about 500,000. So for those of you who have already done your research and these numbers don't marry up, that's why, because these numbers will change as of the 1st of July. Your net assets must be greater than 1.25 million Australian dollars. They can be business assets, they can be your personal assets, they can be assets of yours and your wife or your de facto partner. Like I said, you must have an intention to actively manage a business in Australia. When you apply to the state government, you need to talk about what your intention is, what type of business you intend to run. It doesn't have to be the same business that you currently run in South Africa, but it has to play to your skills. It has to make sense. You have to provide them a business plan of some depth that talks about what your intention is when you get to Australia. So you need to have done your research and either found a gap in the market as to how your business in South Africa will plug into the Australian market, or you need to find a similar business or a business that you can apply your skills to in Australia, that it is plausible that you could come to Australia and actively manage with reasonable success. The state government need to see that your application is likely that you will succeed in what you're saying that you'll do. So that's the criteria to get into Australia on the temporary visa. Like I said, from 1 July, it'll be granted for a period of 5 years. Then you come to Australia on that visa. And once you get in the door, you then need to set about going to work in a business that you own, and setting yourself up for success, so that somewhere down the track within that 5-year period, you can then apply for the permanent visa. So the permanent visa has criteria, and these are the criteria that you need to hit. So you need to have an ownership stake in an Australian business with a turnover of at least $300,000, which is not huge here in Australia. You need to have net assets of at least 600,000 Australian dollars. Your business needs to employ at least 2 full-time staff. These 2 staff cannot be family members, so you can't employ your daughter and your son and say, well, that's the business taken care of. They need to be Australian citizens or permanent residents who are not related to you. You need to physically have lived here in Australia for at least 12 months, and you need to be able to pass medical and police checks. So it's important that when you are applying for this visa, you understand the concept of the temporary visa, and then the concept and the criteria of the permanent visa and the transition which needs to take place, so that you set yourself up for a strategic move to Australia, into a business that's then going to allow you to hit these numbers so that you can then become a permanent resident further down the track. All right, now moving on to the 188B, referred to as the investor visa. So this particular visa is for people who might not want the pressure of running a business, and are happy to make an investment in government bonds, and would prefer, I mean, you can invest in a business of your own at the same time, but if you're choosing this option, you don't have those benchmarks of turnover in an Australian business in order to achieve the permanent residency. So we'll run through the criteria for this visa, for the temporary visa to initially get into Australia. Again, you've got to be under the age of 55, but again, there is an exemption there if you can demonstrate exceptional economic benefit to the state. Some state governments, like Western Australia, for example, say that if you bring more money, if you're willing to double your investment, for example, then they will waive the age criteria. All states have different parameters when it comes to waiving the age criteria. Again, you need to demonstrate an overall successful career in business or investments. In at least one of the past 5 years, you must have managed a business which you had a 10% stake in, or you must have managed investments of a value of at least 1.5 million Australian dollars. Just on the management of those investments, because some of you might have portfolios who are managed by a broker of yours, which is fine, which is within the rules, which is very common. But you need to demonstrate that you are responsible for the decision-making process in the management of those investments, and that you measure the rate of return on those investments, and the decisions you make are based on information that you have of the market. And so essentially what the Australian government is saying is they want to attract people who are educated and savvy on investing, and not people who are fortunate to have wealth and have someone else manage it, but they are actively involved in the day-to-day management of those investments and of their portfolio, and they're up to date on what the market does. And you'll need to demonstrate that you're that person, that you are actively involved and that you are educated on your portfolio. In addition, you need to demonstrate that your net assets are greater than 2.25 million Australian dollars. Again, they can be yours, or yours and your significant other, your spouse, or your de facto partner. And now here's the kicker. Here's what it really takes to achieve this visa. You've got to invest 1.5 million Australian dollars in state government bonds, and it's got to be there for 4 years. So state government bonds are at this point in time, they're a very static investment. They're not returning a great deal. The return on investment, it's kind of like the cash rate at the bank at the moment, or even less in some circumstances. So you're basically giving your capital to the state government for 4 years, and at the end of that 4-year period, they give it back, but you're not going to get a lot of return on that investment. It's worth noting that there is a paper which has been published recently where the government have called for recommendations on how the $1.5 million investment could be used to better effect. And it suggested that they might change this 1.5 million from state government bonds into a more commercial focused investment, where it might be put into the Australian Stock Exchange and split up, similar to how the SIV is split up. And we'll get onto the SIV in a moment. Again, you've got to pass medical and police checks. Once you make the investment into Australia, your visa will be granted. And then you obviously need to then come to Australia, migrate to Australia, and spend a certain amount of time here. So once your funds are invested, you can then concentrate on the permanent visa. And here on the right-hand side, I have the dot points for criteria for the permanent visa. So essentially, you need to hold this investment for 4 years. So the funds will be returned to you at the end of the 4 years, but you're not going to become a permanent resident unless you hold that investment for the full 4-year period. In those 4 years, you've got to be physically located here in Australia for at least 2 of those years. And again, you need to pass medical and police checks. So in comparison to the 188A, the criteria for achieving permanent residency is a lot easier. There's not those benchmarks that we talked about for running a business. So it's a very static investment. You give it to the state government. You say, basically, in 4 years, I'll get my money back, and then, you know, I'll get permanent residency. I don't have those concerns and those benchmarks which I need to hit within a business. So if I want to, I can sit on the beach and, you know, put my feet up and enjoy myself, or I might want to concentrate on doing other things, investing in another business or running another business, but I don't have those concerns about the benchmarks which I need to hit within that particular business. So that's the 188B. Let's move on to C. So significant investor visa. So this is what they refer to as the SIV, the significant investor visa. And again, the criteria for this visa is more simple than the last. Essentially, you need to invest 5 million Australian dollars. So let's run through the criteria quickly. There's no age limit, so they don't mind what age you are. As long as you and your spouse or your de facto partner have assets of at least 5 million Australian dollars, you can demonstrate that those assets are legally acquired. You can demonstrate that they're unencumbered, so you don't have mortgages that are greater than, and you can use those funds for making your complying investment in Australia. Then chances are you'll have a good chance to obtain the SIV. It's worth noting that this particular visa can be sponsored and nominated by a state government. However, it can also be nominated by a federal government body known as Austrade. And if you're using a nomination by Austrade, then you're entitled to this visa without having to make a commitment to any particular state in Australia, which is a good thing. It means you don't have to commit to where you want to live in the long term. You can make that decision when you get here. So the dot points in the middle of the presentation here are all about the complying investment, and this is where I get most questions from clients in regards to this particular type of visa, because everyone wants to know, where's my $5 million going to go? Well, it needs to go into what's referred to as a complying investment. So you don't choose where it goes to a large extent. It's already chosen for you. This particular investment strategy has been designed by the Australian government, and your money goes as set out here in these dot points. So at least 500,000 or 10% of your total investment is invested into venture capital funds or private equity funds that invest in startups and small private companies in Australia. Okay, so obviously what the Australian government are trying to do here is they're trying to plug cash into small businesses who are in their startup phase in Australia, who private equity have identified as businesses with a good runway potentially for success, but need cash to get them off the ground. From the brokers who I speak to in the market who are responsible for making the investment, they tell me that this part of the complying investment is actually the part which returns the most money as far as a rate of return is concerned. Obviously, there's a high risk to this part of the investment, but there's a high rate of return potentially when it goes right. So the second part of the complying investment is at least 1.5 million Australian dollars, or 30% of your total investment, is invested in eligible managed funds or listed investment companies that invest in emerging companies in Australia, again listed on the ASX. So not as risky, but again, investing in Australian companies is what the Australian government's going to do with your money. Again, they're trying to plug more money into the Australian economy and into growing the economy and growing new business here in Australia. And then the balance of your investment, the remaining 3 million Australian dollars goes into more secure investments, more reliable investments. They could be securities, they could be bonds, they could be property, cash and derivatives. So there's a number of different types of investments the balancing investment will go into. When you're making your complying investment in this particular visa category, you will use a broker here in Australia who's a specialist in the SIV category, and they will educate you greatly on their particular portfolio, how many times they've made this investment, what the rate of return is, and you won't go to a normal broker who's just ordinarily invests money for people in the ASX. The people who do this particular investment are specifically focused on this visa type. They know a lot about the visa and they know a lot about the complying investments. There's been some horror stories out there from clients who have unfortunately made investments which were not complying and therefore did not qualify for permanent residency at a later date. So the general criteria for permanent residency is that you must hold this investment, the complying investment, for 4 years, and that you must have lived in Australia for at least 160 days across the course of those 4 years. You must pass medical and police checks as well. So again, it's a more obvious criteria, I guess we could say. There's nothing overly tricky in the criteria. It's basically, have you got the net wealth to invest? Are you willing to hold it for 4 years? If you're ticking those boxes, then chances are that you'll be able to qualify for the SIV. So those are the 3 visas that we're going to talk about today. I've skimmed over them quite quickly. When we go back into more detail, especially in 188A and B, and we get into the nitty-gritties, it can become quite complex when we're assessing your business and how your business and your assets measure up against the criteria. But that's part of our job that we do when assessing you against the criteria. So that's all I'm going to speak about on the visas. A lot of you probably have a lot of questions, and I'm willing to take questions at the end of the presentation and then again after the presentation. For now, I'm going to move on to how Australia's done in COVID. It's obviously a topic which is very relevant to all of us. I was in South Africa last year, February, I think it was, when the first COVID case was announced in South Africa in Durban, and I was actually just about to board a plane as it was announced, and I remember thinking to myself, "Oh, this COVID thing, surely it'll blow over soon." I'm sure it won't make much of an effect on me and my life, but yes, I was dead wrong on that one. I'm not sure when I'll get back to South Africa, but I doubt it's going to be this year. I think international travel is going to be greatly affected for some time to come. But we've been quite fortunate here in Australia with COVID, and we've been fortunate for these reasons that I'm going to talk about now. And I mean, we're an island nation. We're a great big island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and we're here pretty much all on our own. And because of that, we were able to take measures to close our borders, to prevent people coming to Australia and stop the spread of COVID. And we did that relatively early in the piece, which meant that we didn't have a lot of COVID here, and we were able to quarantine and close things down to such an extent that we've virtually eliminated COVID at this point in time. So we still have a very strict quarantine system. If you do manage to come to Australia for whatever reason, then you'll have to do a mandatory 14-day quarantine in a hotel room when you get here. Recently, I had a colleague from our Cape Town office travelled to Australia, or migrated to Australia on a permanent basis with him and his family. So him and his wife and his 2 kids arrived here about 2 months ago. They now work in this office here with me in Melbourne, and they had to do 2 weeks in quarantine with 2 small children in a hotel room. It wasn't easy, but they say it was worth it. So that's what's waiting for you when you get to Australia, is your first 14 days is in a hotel quarantine, unfortunately. There is limited reasons as to why Australian citizens can leave Australia at this point in time. So I can't go on holiday as I normally would in certain parts of the world, or travel to certain parts of the world as I would. Essentially, you can only leave Australia if you've got a good reason, if it's for work, or if it's for attending a funeral or seeing a loved one. You've got to have a pretty good reason to get out of Australia. And we've limited the number of people who can come to Australia, and the visa holders, the foreign citizens who can come to Australia, have been limited based on certain skills and visa types. And these things that the Australian government have done haven't been popular, not with the Australian public and not with overseas citizens, because it's greatly disadvantaged people. But what it has done, I guess, is it has prevented the spread of COVID here in Australia, and now we enjoy life here in Australia pretty much without COVID, and life's fairly normal. In addition to that, our government handed out large subsidies to businesses across Australia during the pandemic, whilst we were getting over the initial shock of the pandemic and initial lockdowns and things like that. There were large government subsidies handed out so that the economy kept on ticking along, and so that businesses kept their head above water, and so that we can bounce back out of COVID. And now our unemployment rate is back down to 5.6%, as compared to about 5.1% pre-pandemic. So economy's chugging along pretty well here in Australia, and Federal Treasury is pretty happy with how things are going. Our vaccine program hasn't gone all that well. We still haven't got that many people vaccinated. The government said we'd have everyone vaccinated by October this year. That's probably not going to happen. It is a bit of an issue because the sooner we get vaccinated, the sooner we can open up our borders and really start, seeing other people and trading with other people and getting more skills in. But we have got a plan to roll out vaccines across Australia entirely. I think this week they've started vaccinating those who are between 50 and 60 years of age, so they're slowly working their way down the age brackets. We have a massive amount of spending at the moment on infrastructure, so projects like road and rail, mining, resources, etc. There's a huge amount of government spending going on here in Australia at the moment. So it's a good time to be in Australia as far as the economy is concerned, jobs is concerned, and if you work in construction, or in mining, or in associated industries, then you're probably going to do pretty well at the moment. The price of iron ore on the global scale at the moment is, I think, almost at an absolute all-time record high, and we export a lot of iron ore out of out of Western Australia, out of the Pilbara. China buys a lot of iron ore from us to make steel. And this is driving our economy and bringing in a lot of income into Australia, which is good for our overall wealth. In total, although it's very sad, we only had just over 900 deaths here in Australia for COVID, and of those, almost 800 or just over 800 were here in Victoria, and most of those were in aged care. So on the world scale, we've navigated our way through COVID very well, and we haven't been impacted all that much. And now we find ourselves in a very COVID normal manner. We don't wear masks. Social distancing is not really a thing. To give you an example, there was 85,000 people attended a sporting match at the MCG, just a kilometre away from where I'm sitting now, on Friday night last week. And that's the new normal for us. We don't have any COVID community transmission here in Australia, so life is pretty normal as far as COVID is concerned for the time being. We have had little outbreaks here and there. Someone was seen to have COVID in New South Wales day before yesterday. They're not sure how he contracted it. Must have got out of quarantine somehow. So we're going to have little outbreaks here and there, but it looks for the large part that we're keeping on top of those outbreaks. And then a little bit more about COVID, but how it relates to the visa, which is good news for anyone applying for this particular visa type. So the 188 business and investment visas are liked by the Australian government. The Australian government see these visas as ways to bring quality migrants to Australia. So the Australian government want more people to come to Australia on these particular visas because they see people who apply for these visas are innovative, entrepreneurial, skilled people with some wealth. They want to come to Australia and they want to impart those skills and those entrepreneurial habits into Australia and into the Australian economy, and it's a good thing for Australia. And so for these reasons, and further to help Australia respond from our COVID slump, the Australian government has taken some steps to boost this particular visa category. So they've doubled the visa category from a quota of just over 7,000 in the year prior to just over 13,000 in this current year. We have our migration planning levels announced on the 1st of July each year, and we expect that they will probably maintain that level or even increase it further. From July 1 this year, they have introduced a new streamlined priority processing system for this particular visa as well, which is great news. It means you're going to get processed quicker, get to Australia sooner. And they have made all visa holders of the 188 visas exempt from the inward travel bans. So a lot of other people who have temporary visas can't come to Australia at this point in time, whereas everyone holding a 188 visa is exempt from the travel bans. All right, I feel like I've been talking for a long time, and I hope I've managed to hold most of your attention. But I'm going to stop now, and I think we're going to bring Andy back, Sarah, and Andy's going to talk to you a little bit further about who we are and how we can assist you.
Sam, thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree there's a lot of information there. And at first listen, it's always very, very complex. But Sam is a specialist, and please certainly do reach out to him. Sam, I think you must have explained it really well because there are not a hell of a lot of questions, but we'll get to that shortly. But just very quickly, on these particular visas, as Sam said, they're sort of fairly COVID friendly. If Australia is a place that you want to go via this route. So how would one take a next step? And really what you do is you get in touch with us. We'll understand your family structure, what you're looking to try and achieve. And then based on that, so you'll have a chat with Sam and his team, understand exactly what it entails. And then once you make the decision to sort of move forward, then everything sort of kicks into play. Locally here, we'll help you with all the paperwork, etc., that you need in order to start collating all the information for your application, all with the guidance of the team in Australia. And, right down to when you're actually making the investment, we can assist you with all your tax clearances to move your foreign exchange over to Australia. We obviously, in the FX business, we have the ability to get the clearances from the Reserve Bank if it's more than your annual allowances of 11 million rand per person. So, just understand that you're in good hands. We understand all the different aspects of the process, and more importantly, we can really help you with all of them. So that's the approach. We do look at a turnkey from sort of cradle to grave to make sure that what is actually quite an arduous journey is made a little bit easier. And also what we do is we keep you focused so that you actually keep the momentum up, because what often also happens is when somebody embarks on a journey like this, the complexity just tends to put that sort of on the back burner. So if you do want to make this move, start the inquiry and start your planning sooner rather than later. So that sort of leaves me to go into the Q&A. I think we've gone on for almost 50 minutes now. So I think, Sam, what I'll do is I'll just ask you one or two sort of common questions that sort of do pop up. The one question that I thought well worth posing on the significant investor visa. I know that I think 60% of the investment can go into sort of more conventional investments, and one of the classes mentioned there was property or real estate. Is that still something that has to be bought through that broker, or can one make an investment in a residential property to live in that would then count towards that investment?
Well, no, the entire investment must be made through the broker. So if you choose to make a purchase outside of that 5 million, then that's not counted inside of the designated investment. So yeah, it's important to note that the broker will take care of the entire investment. You do get some choice as to where that investment might be made when it comes to that to the balancing 60%. And when it comes to property and real estate, it might be that the broker says, well, there's some commercial real estate in this portfolio that we could put some funds into, but it's certainly not going to be your residential property that is invested into within the 5 million designated investment.
Thanks very much. Hence the name Significant Investment Visa. The other question is, at the end of the period, do I get all my money back from my investment, or is there any portion of that that is ever a donation to the Australian state or to federal government?
Yeah, good question, and a common question. First of all, you'll get paid a return on investment, usually on a quarterly basis, whether it be through the SIV or whether it be through the standard investor visa with the government bonds. There is no donation made to government, so government are not deducting from your investment at all. The 188B, where you're putting 1.5 million into government bonds, is obviously a very secure investment. It's a government treasury bond. The return on investment is very low, but you're entitled to and will get back your entire investment at the end of that period of investment. Obviously, with the significant investor visa, the 5 million Australian dollars, which is broken up into a different portfolio, there's some risk built into that, obviously. So there's a potential to lose some money on some investments, but obviously to make money elsewhere in the entire category. But again, there's no donation made, unlike some other investment programs throughout other parts of the world. This is a purely commercial investment across the ASX.
Great, thanks very much. I think that's a very important point you made. I mean, there are a wide variety of these investment migration programs, and some of them have got really significant donations to government, and some of them have got, I think also some fairly risky investments. I think just by virtue of what, where they are, et cetera, et cetera. I think certainly Australia represents a totally well-balanced strategy compared to living in a place like South Africa. I mean, just listening to you throughout that conversation, your government's obviously very on top of how much capital it needs and where it needs to be deployed, and where the skills through the skilled visas need to be deployed, which is it's good to see. Just another question. Can one continue to run their business in their home country, say for argument, back in Johannesburg, whilst transitioning on the move to Australia?
Yeah, for sure. Look, very few people pick up their whole life and move in one solid transition. Most of my clients will still have investments. They'll still have interests in businesses. They'll have ownership stakes. They'll have management responsibilities. So a lot of my clients will be spending time in both countries. Pre-COVID, it'd be common for these clients to be going back and forth between Australia and South Africa to continue to manage businesses and transition from one country to the other. And quite often, the business in South Africa is assisting from a cash flow point of view. So you don't want to divest of that business immediately. You want to continue to run that. You might sell a portion of it to a partner and transition out of it that way. But it's very common to continue to own and run a business or investments in South Africa or in other parts of the world whilst you establish yourself in Australia.
Great, thanks for that. And then Sam, just one of the things, I mean, we were talking about this, the difference between the states, the various state governments, etc. And in terms of how they measure applicants, I assume some states are easier than others to get into, or is it a pretty level playing field?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Definitely some states are more popular than others. The majority of the clients that I speak to say, we want to go to Brisbane, we want to go to the Gold Coast, we want to go and live in Noosa. These are lovely places in the world to live. But this means that Queensland's very popular, and so they have a lot of applicants, and so Queensland has the opportunity to pick and choose as to who they want. And so they have tightened their funnel, so to speak. So not everyone will get into Queensland, and then people will need to look at other states and territories. But they will learn that there's a lot of other beautiful places in Australia with a lot of opportunities, and that they might need to curtail their enthusiasm about the Gold Coast for a period of time. You might get there eventually. You could. I say to some of my clients, go to Adelaide. Adelaide's beautiful. It's still close to the beach. It's very close to the wine farms. The Barossa and the McLaren Vale are right there on your doorstep. It's got a lot to offer. If I didn't live in Melbourne, I'd probably live in Adelaide. And I've got clients now who are in Adelaide who've been there for just over a year, and they say, Sam, we're never moving to the Gold Coast because we love Adelaide so much. So be careful what you wish for. The grass is not always greener on the other side. Have a broad and open mind to where it is that you might land in Australia is my advice.
Great. Well, thank you. That was well explained. I think that kind of brings me to the end of the Q&A. Sam, before I sort of wrap up, is there any sort of parting advice or comment that you'd like to give to our listeners?
The last thing that I always like to impart onto prospective migrants is get in touch, talk to a registered agent, do your research. Do not embark on this mission on your own. It's not something that I advise anyone to do on your own. It's a minefield out there. So whether you engage with us or whether you engage with another registered agent or immigration lawyer, make sure you get special advice. Make sure you talk to someone who's done this before.
Great. Thanks very much. I think that's very sage advice. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, thanks very much for giving up an hour of your day to come and listen to us. And I guess my wrap-up summary is it's very similar. The minute you start putting a border between yourself and your investments, or you start deciding to physically relocate, you introduce all sorts of different risk. And it's very important to understand before you physically relocate is speak to your financial advisor. You're very welcome to chat to us. We've got some great advisors in our team. Understand what the implications are tax-wise. When you start physically moving yourself and your business, it can trigger all sorts of capital gains events. There's a lot of things one needs to consider. And what we see often is people make very emotional decisions about relocating, and they don't always look before they leap. And it can be really, really costly. And you always hear stories of people who go and it wasn't quite what they expected. They end up coming back. These are significant events in one's life and can really wipe out a lot of your wealth. So make sure that you're dealing with people, check them out, do your due diligence, never rush. And, act if you feel that you do want to move and you want to create some sort of future legacy for your children and your family outside of the country. By all means, do it. But just do it carefully and make sure that you plan. And good luck with your decisions. And on the screen there are details. Please get in touch. You can get directly in touch with Sam via the migration@sableinternational.com, or you can get hold of us in Cape Town through im@sableinternational.com. But once again, thanks so much, and you will all get a recording with all the slides of the webinar. So thanks very much. Thank you, Sam, and we'll chat soon. Go and enjoy your last beer before you jump into bed.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Cheers.
Cheers now. Bye-bye.